While watching the games of Carson, I realized that he often uses the Pirc Defense against White's first king's pawn move, pawn to e4, and I decided to investigate why he plays that and what are the advantages. Indeed, it turned out that the Pirc Defense comes with a number of perks. Well, first of all, it's a very simple system to play. You just play same opening moves no matter what your opponent wants to play. You hit this pawn, they defend it anyhow, you go g6, bishop g7, and you castle. Like, it's just like London system. You just play your system no matter what, super simple. Another big advantage of this opening is that you put your king to safety within the first 5 moves. Therefore, you avoid any opening disasters. You're not going to be checkmated, at least not in an opening. And lastly, it's a very deceptive system. What's cool about this is that initially it looks like you play modest moves, and your opponents often have this false impression of safety. They overextend their position, they try to attack you, and that's when you hit them hard with your own counterattack. What can your opponent choose to play against the Pirc Defense? Well, most of your opponents who don't know much or anything about it will just play casual developing moves, knight f3, bishop c4, and they will castle, which is not dangerous, and I'll show you a simple and effective plan against it. Now, pros usually play pawn f4, known as the Austrian attack, or the simply put the 3 pawns attack. Now, and indeed it's a more ambitious opening where white controls a whole lot of squares in the middle of the board, and also they reinforce the threat of going pawn to e5 at some point. It is an ambitious system, but there is also a downside. The downside is they overextend their position, they weaken a whole lot of squares around their own king, while they are mostly underdeveloped. Therefore, there are some really tricky and cool ways to counter that. We'll talk about this as well. Another aggressive attempt that your opponents will gonna use is bishop e3. They aim to play queen d2 and then maybe pawn to f3, and they hope to play something like bishop h6, h4, h5, and checkmate you along the h file within a couple of moves. But that's too good to be true, and I'll show you the most effective way to counterattack that really ruins white's position very quickly in most cases. Alright, now let's get down to business, and we'll start from the most challenging option, pawn to f4, the most ambitious way for white to play. After that, guess what? You play bishop g7, you just fianchetto your bishop, and here after knight f3, there are different ways for black to go about this. You could just castle, but I recommend striking in the center straight away with the move pawn to c5. Now, why do you want to play this move? Generally speaking, since you've got this pawn on d6, at some point later in the game, you're very likely to counterattack your opponent's center, either by going c5 or maybe e5. Usually we'll pick one of these two options. And now, because white controls this e5 square just way too well, like we strike with pawn to c5, and it already says the very first trick. Now you want to just destroy their pawn center so that it's not that strong and it does not control everything, and your opponents will often take on c5, hoping you to recapture, which would allow them to take on d8, force your king to move, and that would indeed be very good for them. But here comes the first surprise. You don't recapture, instead you play queen a5. And at first it looks like you just want to recapture the pawn with your queen, but of course your opponent thinks to themselves, hey, but why can't I just take one more pawn on d6? And it looks like they're devastating your position, exposing your king, but there is one thing that your opponent missed here. It's the fact that from here, not only the queen threatened the pawn on c5, but also it pinned the knight on c3. And now we're going to play knight takes c4, starting a super strong counterattack. Now the knight is pinned, meaning it can't move. Now we attack it with our knight, and also with the bishop on g7. Very often your opponent kind of forgets about the fact that this fianchetto bishop often plays a crucial role into your attack. But just because it stands closer to black position, white kind of doesn't feel the danger, but it is dangerous. And now you're going to grab on c3, then recapture and start a massive attack. Now if they cover with the bishop, then you still take on c3, ruining their pawn structure. Again, we've got a bishop right here. So if they capture with a bishop, we just take. If he takes with a pawn, there are different ways you can play, but I think the best way is just to castle quickly, because what you want to do is you want to put your rook to e-file and start attacking him. Now, moreover, they will usually help you, because they see that this pawn is hanging, they take it, but that's no problem, because you go rook e8, you recapture this pawn back right on the next move, and then you take aim at their king. If they try to cover it by bishop e2, there's another prudent move that you gotta play here. Like, you could take this pawn, but then he wants to sneak away into castling and feel good. But you want to stop him from castling by playing queen c5, which takes away this square, meaning that he can't castle anymore, and now white has a big problem. His king got stuck in the middle of the board. You're going to capture this pawn on e7 and then just finish your development quickly and go hard against the king. You're probably going to checkmate it within a couple moves if white doesn't find the way to somehow secure the king. Now, there are a couple of attempts that your opponents are typically going to be using here. One of them is playing rook b1, and after you take the pawn, they're going to go rook b5. They attack the queen, they hope for the queen to go back somewhere, and then they castle. But of course, you can upset them with a simple but effective queen takes b5. What your opponent overlooked here is the fact that this bishop on e2 is actually pinned, therefore it cannot capture a queen, and rook b5 was just a blunder of a rook. The other way for your opponent to try to prepare themselves for castling the next move is going knight to d4. They hope to block the diagonal so that they can castle after that, but you just want to trade off this knight, so you go knight c6, developing your own knight and offering an exchange. Want to trade it off so that our queen still controls the square and he still cannot castle. Now, if he castles anyways, then after this trade on d4, what's bad for white is that they once again forgot about our sniper bishop on g7. And this time it's a check to the king and a double attack to the rook on a1. Now the king has to move, and now we grab this juicy rook in the corner of the board. We've got our bishop supporting, therefore after this trade, we actually won the exchange. We can now finally pick up this pawn on e7 and hit the bishop, and then you're simply up an exchange in an endgame. He's got a bunch of weaknesses, so you can simply develop, bring your rooks into play, and you're going to win the game easily. Now, of course, your opponent could play better moves, and we're going to talk about this right now, but you can just see the deceptive nature of the Pirc defense. Your opponent feels no danger, plays seemingly good-looking moves, and all of a sudden his position falls apart within a couple of moves. Now, after f4, once again, let's go into the main line, but we'll try to play better for your opponent. Knight f3, c5, we strike in the center. He takes on c5, we play queen a5, this tricky move, which, as we already know, not only attacks the pawn, but also puts the pin against the knight, and therefore it's a much better option for white not to take on d6, but to play bishop d3 just to protect their center, so they gotta be more careful. Now after that, you just take back your pawn on c5, and you succeeded in destroying their beautiful pawn center. Also from c5, you still block them from castling, therefore they still have to deal with that somehow. Now the natural way of doing that would be playing queen e2, so that on the next move they can play bishop e3 and attack your queen, and then they're getting ready to castle. Now here, the solid way for black is just to return back to a5 and play kind of like the dragon variation of the Sicilian defense, but the tricky move which I like is queen b4. Now I won a number of games just by exactly the trap which I'm about to share with you, because your opponent is highly likely to notice that you're gonna take this pawn and attack the knight on c3. Therefore they wish to defend this pawn somehow, either by going rook b1 or by castling queenside. And strangely enough, in both of those cases, there is similar unexpected tactics that works. For example, they castle queenside, and all of a sudden you play knight takes c4. That comes completely out of a blue clear sky. Like, they didn't expect this. It seemed like their e4 pawn is super well defended, but still you play this. Again, they forgot about our sniper bishop. Now, here's the deal. If they recapture with a knight, that's actually completely bad, because now, thanks to our bishop and a queen, we just finished the game within a couple moves. Check, check, and then queen to b2 checkmate. That's pretty nice. Now let's take it back and let's see what else your opponent could play here. The bishop takes e4 is a better try for your opponent, but still after bishop takes c3, it's not good. Now queen takes b2 is coming, they have to take, and now you can grab this undefended bishop on e4, and as a result of this little tactical operation, we grab the pawn on e4, we ruined the pawn structure around their king, the king is exposed, and again, you just got a winning position. Now I'd like to share with you one really cool game which followed another opening variation. Here black did not play c5, which I do recommend that you play. Instead, black simply castled. So that's another line, not what I recommend you to play, but anyway, it illustrates overall vibe of the opening, and I think it's pretty cool. Now here white played bishop e3 just to overprotect their center. Black played knight d7, preparing to either break open with c5 or e5 down the line, and white played e5 themselves, attacking this knight. Now, so far white was probably feeling pretty good about their position. They've got strong center, now they kick the knight away, they're dominating, it looks like you're just crawling here in the last couple of ranks, maybe your knight is now going to go back to e8 as well. White was probably pretty happy about their position, but little do they know. Now, let's see what happens within the next few moves. Black plays knight g4, attacking the bishop. And actually the knight on g4 is placed pretty well. It puts the pressure to the bishop, also to the center. Even if white ever plays h3 and your knight has to go back, after that it's going to return back through this f5 square, and it will also be cool. Anyway, right now white needs to deal with this attack, so they went it back, and here comes c5. Now, that's a very common pattern. If you notice that your opponent starts attacking you and he overextends his position while being undefended, it's really good to strike in the center and his position falls apart. Now already white probably starts been worried about their position, because you attack all these pawns and it feels like it's gonna fall apart. And indeed, like if white takes on d6, which what they did, black recaptured on d4, this time also hitting this knight. If white takes here, black simply recaptures with check. Again, it's not good for white. In the game, I found actually quite a creative move. They played knight takes d4, grabbing the pawn, and it turns out that it is actually a discover attack of this knight on g4. Pretty cool. So they think, okay, black is gonna take here, I'm gonna take on g4. But at this point, the black knight went on kamikaze mode and said, hey, if I'm doomed to perish, I'm gonna serve my army. And he played knight e2. Like, we're going a little too dark here, right? Let's come back to chess. Now, we're forking the king and rook, and black says, hey, if you want to take it, use your king for that, so that the king will be exposed, and after this I'll recapture, and now you'll be in trouble. However, white also exercised their own creativity, and instead they didn't actually take the knight. They say, okay, I'm gonna play queen e2, and I still do not want to move my king. I want to capture it with a queen, and if you get my rook, guess what? I'll play pawn takes c7 with a double attack to your queen and rook. It's interesting how both players are very creative. And here black came up with one more counter blow, pawn e5. Now, funnily enough, computer says that here for white it was best to play knight e6, which is a complete madness, just trying to close the e-file. But in the game, white played a more natural move, of course. He just grabbed the knight, but now pawn takes d4, also hitting this knight. I played knight d5, and that's another tricky move of white. He noticed that black is going to play rook e8 and attack this uncastled king. Notice how prudent you were by castling early in the game, right? So your king is in safety. But now after rook e8, white is going to play an illegal move, a counter check. Check in response to a check, which is known as a cross check, and that helps white to stay in the game. Therefore, black did not play this check, and instead he just played knight c5. He said, okay, this knight is kind of shaky, I'm going to get this pawn and attack the knight after that. White decided to trade it off. He played knight e7 check, king goes, knight takes c8, rook takes, and now finally white wants some time to finally castle. Therefore, there is no check along this file anymore, and he thinks that his position is good. But it's too early for white to relax, because after queen b6, it turns out that black actually still has a huge attack against the king. We've got our rook right here, we've got our queen right here, and also our sniper bishop that your opponent always keeps forgetting about is ready to join the party. And in fact, white is already defenseless. In the game, he played rook e1, and after d3, which simply threatened queen takes b2, and white resigned. Again, notice our bishop here. And if white plays anything else, c3 or whatever, then there is one more tactical motif, which I'd like you to notice and to write down in comments below. As a general note, I do understand that playing and learning a new opening can feel overwhelming because of the quantity of new variations, but let's not forget that your opponents in most cases know nothing about the Pirc defense at all. Therefore, just watching this video is already enough to be superior. Plus, I also do recommend that you check out my free masterclass, where I narrow it down to the 3 most important rules for you to know to play any opening well, and I'll drop a link down below in the description and you can check out the masterclass after watching this video. Now when we're done with the most ambitious pawn f4 move, let's come back to one of the most common moves for your opponents to react, just plain developing moves knight f3 and then bishop c4. They play standard moves that they typically play in the Italian game and whatnot. Then you castle and white castles as well. Now, in this case, white was a little bit more accurate. They did not overextend and they still developed their pieces, which is fine. Now, you're going to do the same. You're going to develop your pieces and attack their center. Because still, these pawns is both an advantage and a disadvantage of the white position because they're advanced, so easier for you to attack. Now, you go bishop g4. What's the point? Well, we've got this fianchettoed bishop on g7, which puts long-term pressure to this pawn on d4. And therefore want to reinforce this pressure by playing bishop g4, which pins this knight on f3, and then by going knight c6, which would add one more attack to this pawn. So let me show you how it goes. Usually they'll play h3 sooner or later, then you trade off, they recapture, then you go knight c6, and this pawn is already hanging. Now, if it ever goes back, oh, sorry, it can't go back, it's got to go forward. So d5, then you play knight e5. And after that, you hit these 2 pieces, you're going to trade off one of them. That's nice. Now, if they guard the pawn instead, then you play pawn e5. Now, that hits the pawn for the second time. Again, if they trade on e5, no problem. You're going to recapture with a knight with this double attack. Pretty cool, and you destroyed their center successfully. It's more challenging if they push forward, but then you're not going to go back, even though it's relatively okay. But knight e4 is just more aggressive. You attack the queen, you attack the pawn. If they trade, now thanks to this pawn, they have to move their knight away, which is also nice. And after knight e2, Now, there are a number of ways for you to guard this pawn, but the easiest is actually to counterattack with rook to e8, and you counterattack their pawn on e4. Also, thanks to this exchange on d4, actually it prolongs the diagonal for your fianchetto bishop, which is cool. And now, let's say they take on d4, now you also take their pawn, our knight is guarded, therefore they can't take it. Now that also opens up a diagonal for our bishop, so we start putting pressure down here, which feels annoying. And actually, the white position is already quite unpleasant. They're not losing here, they can play on, of course. But still, white is already at a disadvantage. You're putting pressure, they have to deal with it somehow. You can play even queen h4, something like this. And very often they actually play c3, if I'm not mistaken, that's the most common move for white to play, which actually blunders this fork with knight to d2, which attacks the queen, rook, and even this bishop. But most likely you're going to capture either the queen or the rook, and you also get a winning position. Now, you also definitely need to know how to deal with the plan starting from bishop to e3, because you can't just play your standard moves. In this case, it's not the best idea. If you simply play a bishop g7 and then you castle, then you walk into this standard attack, and indeed it can get dangerous pretty quick. So what do you do instead of that? Well, you want to make sure, since we anticipate opposite side castings, you're likely to castle kingside at some point, and they are going to castle queenside. We want to make sure that our attack on the queen side is faster, and so we start it straight away, which is the best way to ensure you're faster, right? We rush into our attack. You play c6, right here. After they play queen d2, you go b5. And right now, this b5 move actually threatens b4, kicking away this knight, and this knight will no longer guard the pawn a4, which means that after the knight goes, he'll be free to play b4, followed by knight takes e4, and also hit their queen, which means that they need to deal with this threat somehow. Now, they could play pawn a3, theoretically, but generally speaking, it's not what they want, because they are going to castle queenside. And if they play this move pawn a3 in the future, it will be super easy for you to play pawn a5, b4, and blow up the position on the queen side and attack them there. Therefore, a3 would just be a mistake for white, considering their plan. Instead, they want to play pawn f3 and guard the pawn this way. There's also a side benefit of this move pawn f3 is that they also control this square g4 so that you can't ever jump there with your knight or bishop. So f3 is the move they're going to play. Now, you still don't develop your kingside pieces. We still don't do this. We delay our plan because we want to prepare our counter-attacking plan. And you play instead knight d7, which is a multi-purpose move. Like, in the future, your knight is probably going to go to b6 and also support your queenside attack. But along the way, you also add one more control to this square e5, just to make sure that you never have to worry with them playing e5 and attacking you. So knight d7 secures you from that as well. Now, after knight d7, your opponent kind of feels a little bit unclear what to do. You know, they were going to play h4, h5, bishop h6 and attack your castle king, but there is no king. And there is no sign of you trying to even prepare your castle in there. So they're a little bit clueless, like you break their plan. And they'll probably castle queenside. But now as they do so, it's much easier for you to attack them because we know for sure that their king is there. And you can do that by playing queen a5. And that reinforces the threat of pawn b4, because this time, after the knight goes, that'll allow us to grab the pawn on a2 and to attack him after that. That's, once again, a big threat. They're going to play king b1 to guard the pawn. And only then, when we made sure that our attack on the queen side is so strong, is so quick, then you're okay to play bishop g7 and possibly consider castling, but also we're not in a rush. Like, we'll see whether we want to castle or we want to continue with our own attack on the queen side. Both ways are possible. We'll see depending on the situation. Let's say they try to play something like h4, executing their plan, and in such positions, usually it's actually not a bad idea to play h5. Because, you know, this actually stops them from advancing the h-pawn. Also, g4 is no longer an option because you can simply take it. We control this square twice. Plus, thanks to the h5 move, bishop h6 is no longer possible. We've got our rook and our bishop here. That would just blunder a bishop in one move. Therefore, after h5, it's not easy for white to decide how to attack next. What are the next moves for them to play? But in this case, your position is actually so strong that you don't even have to worry about their attack at all. You can just go hard on your own attack on the queen side. And you can do so by going knight b6 or bringing more pieces towards his king. And after this, let's say they go g4, getting ready to play h5. Then you play b4, kicking away this knight, the final defender of the king. The knight has to go back. There's only one square to go to. Now, notice that the knight blocks the bishop. And because the bishop is obstructed, it no longer controls this square. And we can jump with our own knight forward and attack the queen, attack the bishop, and maybe put some pressure against this pawn. Oh, now that's already pretty annoying, and most likely white is already going down here. Now they have to somehow deal with this threat to their king, queen, and bishop. If they go forward, then you could take the bishop. That would be fine. Their bishop is a strong piece, and you don't mind trading it off. But in this case, it's even stronger to go bishop a6 and mount greater pressure. This time, thanks to this x-ray, you threaten all kinds of knight a3, check to the king, and discovered attack of the queen thing, so that doesn't feel comfortable for white. Let's take it back. If instead they play queen c1, then they hold on to the position, but notice how passive they are and how bad their pieces are. We can then develop our bishop not here, but this way. And this time we're threatening queen takes a2 on the next move. Like, want to trade off the knight for a bishop and then play queen takes a2. Again, they have to do something. They have to play b3, but this time they weaken their king further. Plus our knight can now jump forward and start attacking the king straight away. The king has to go somewhere to b2 or a1, doesn't matter. You can then play c5. And what it does, it opens potentially the c file for your rook to join the party and to start attacking them. But also there is one more idea which your opponents will typically overlook, because the most played move in this position is pawn d5. They were hoping to attack your bishop, but as often happens in the Pirc defense, they forgot about your sniper bishop. Knight takes d5 is a beautiful finish of the game. It actually is a discovered check, and not only a discovered check, there is no normal way for white to cover at all. Like the king has no moves, our knight takes away this square, our bishop attacks along this diagonal, and we put together almost a checkmating position. Like if they try to cover, we play knight takes c3, and it's still all the same stuff. So if they trade, bishop takes c3, and now they have to give up the queen, but of course that'll only prolong the game for a few more moves, but after that it's still going to be easily winning. So bishop b3, c2, knight c2, all kinds of threats, and you're easily winning. So far we have covered all the major systems of the Pirc defense, besides just one, which is bishop g5, putting pressure down here, and then playing pawn e5. Now here black really needs to be careful, because if black does not know what they're doing, their position can be ruined within a couple moves. And that's why a lot of tricky fellas love playing this opening system as white. Some of these tricky fellas are you. That's why you may wish to check out this video right here so that you know how to play right, whether you're playing it with white or black. And as I mentioned earlier, if you want to learn how to play any opening well, feel free to head on to this free masterclass by clicking the link up there and learning the 3 universal rules to play any opening well.